General Hospital spoilers for Tuesday, July 29 reveal that Curtis had never considered himself a man incapable of seeing the bigger picture. Yet as the aftermath of his actions began to settle over Port Charles like the heavy shadow of a storm, he realized with sharp clarity that he had misjudged everything. In his effort to deliver what he saw as a necessary truth, Curtis had undone more than just the thin veil of lies that hung over Drew and Nina. He had unraveled an entire emotional ecosystem that had been delicately, painfully constructed. The moment he told Willow about the summer affair between Drew and her mother, a chain reaction ignited, tearing through relationships, reputations, and fragile hopes like wildfire. Curtis had convinced himself that Willow deserved to know, that she had the right to walk into her marriage without the weight of a secret hovering over her like a ticking time bomb. But truth, he now understood, did not exist in a vacuum. It came with consequences, and in this case, it came with devastation. Willow had unraveled before his very eyes, collapsing under the weight of betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. Her trust in her mother, already frayed from years of tension, had completely snapped. Her love for Drew had curdled into rage, leaving her standing at the altar not as a bride but as a storm of fury seconds away from destruction. And through it all, Curtis stood on the sidelines, the man who had lit the match. The guilt came slowly at first, a twinge, a whisper, a shadow of second-guessing. But as the days passed and the dust refused to settle, it grew louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. Curtis began to replay every moment leading up to that confession. The way Nina had tried to find stability in her daughter's life, the effort Drew had put into proving himself worthy, the tentative peace that had taken months to establish. He had shattered it all in seconds. And why? For the sake of the truth? Or was it his own buried resentment? His own need to stir waters that were finally starting to calm? Nina's silence in the aftermath spoke volumes. She didn't yell, didn't plead. She simply turned away, shoulders squared, face pale, eyes hollow. It was that quiet retreat that hurt the most, the unspoken acknowledgement that Curtis had robbed her of something priceless, the chance to explain, to reconcile, to do it her own way. He had stolen her voice in her daughter's eyes, and that theft sat on his conscience like lead. Now, everywhere Curtis went, he saw the damage. Michael's simmering distrust, Drew's battered pride, Willow's spiraling behavior. Even Portia, once proud of his convictions, had begun to look at him with concerned distance. His decision hadn't just affected one wedding, it had reverberated across every relationship that had been tied to that delicate day. What made it worse was the realization that his actions weren't just careless, they were arrogant. Curtis had appointed himself the moral authority without recognizing that morality, like grief, is personal. His apology, when it came, would not fix what he had broken. But it was the first step in acknowledging the pain he had caused. He owed Nina more than words. He owed her the truth of his regret. He owed Willow the space to heal, free from the shadows of his own judgment. And he owed himself the discipline to pause next time before tearing open wounds that time had only just begun to scab over. Curtis couldn't sleep. The image of Willow's tear-streaked face haunted his mind, etched into every moment of silence that surrounded him. He replayed her trembling voice, the way her hands had curled into fists, and the sheer devastation in her eyes as she processed the news. It was more than heartbreak, he had detonated something inside her, something irreparable. He hadn't just exposed an affair. He had dismantled her belief in love, in family, in trust. The more he thought about it, the more Curtis realized that the truth wasn't a weapon to be wielded, it was a responsibility. One he had failed to carry with care. There had been 1,000 better ways to handle it, 100 moments when he could have paused, consulted, or even warned Nina before speaking. But he hadn't. And now, the fallout was his to own. Portia's quiet dismay, the way she looked at him not with anger but with sorrow, told him everything he needed to know. He had not only betrayed Nina, he had betrayed himself. Still, Curtis wasn't ready to disappear into guilt. He had to do more than feel sorry, he had to make things right, or at least try. He started by drafting a letter to Willow, unsure if she would ever read it. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted her to know that his actions had come from a flawed place of love. He would speak to Nina too, face her silence, her fury, her heartbreak. He owed her the truth of his intentions, no matter how misguided they were. Redemption, he knew, wouldn't come quickly. But it could come, if he stayed true now. He folded the letter, heart heavy but resolute, and finally, he allowed himself to hope that even shattered trust could someday be rebuilt. For Curtis, redemption would not come through grand gestures or sweeping confessions. It would come in silence, in small acts of humility, in choosing to listen rather than speak. He had made a mess of something fragile and sacred, and now he had to sit with that mess and learn from it. The journey forward would be slow. And it might never lead to forgiveness, but it had to start somewhere. And for Curtis, it started with the hardest words of all, "I'm sorry." Tracy had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to anticipate disaster before it struck and to keep her emotional investments at arm's length. But even she had to admit that something unexpected was unfolding before her eyes, something that didn't quite fit the cynical worldview she'd come to rely on. It wasn't just about Cody anymore. He had entered her orbit as a wild card, unpredictable, impulsive, far too charming for his own good, but somewhere along the way, his recklessness had begun to soften. And as strange as it seemed, much of that change traced back to Molly. The connection between Molly and Cody was not the type that made immediate sense to outsiders. She was principled, measured, intellectual, a woman who had planned every step of her life like a blueprint. Cody, on the other hand, moved like a gust of wind, inconsistent, emotional, and loyal in all the most unexpected ways. Yet somehow, the very things that should have clashed between them had begun to complement. His spontaneity pulled her out of her head, while her stability anchored him to something real. Tracy watched from a distance as the two navigated their budding relationship with a blend of awkwardness and undeniable chemistry, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something that resembled cautious optimism. What unsettled everyone else, their differences, their pasts, their entanglements, seemed to strengthen rather than weaken them. Molly, once consumed by a vision of perfection that excluded mess and risk, had begun to embrace the imperfections that came with loving someone like Cody. And Cody, who had spent most of his adult life convincing himself that he didn't deserve anything resembling permanence, had begun to crave the exact thing he thought he'd never have, a future. But while the quiet transformation between them grew, it had ripple effects far beyond their immediate circle. Tracy, despite herself, had found in Cody a kind of surrogate son she never knew she needed. And as Molly began letting go of past pains and idealistic rigidity, she started opening doors that had long been bolted shut, doors that led not just to new love but to her own emotional liberation. The town of Port Charles, ever sensitive to change, couldn't help but buzz. Everyone had an opinion. Some scoffed, unable to picture Cody settling into anything resembling a real relationship. Others pitted Molly, assuming she had wandered too far from her own identity. But the reality was far more complicated, and far more fascinating. Because beneath the gossip and raised eyebrows, something undeniably magnetic was taking place. They were falling in love. Not the kind of love built on fairy tales or calculated plans, but the kind that defied reason and took root in chaos. And that love, imperfect and raw, had the power to upend everything. Tracy, for her part, had begun to advocate for them in quiet ways. She didn't offer declarations or endorsements, her approval came in subtle nods, in well-timed interjections, and in the fierce protectiveness that she reserved only for those who had earned it. Cody had earned it. Molly had surprised her. And together, they had become something no one saw coming. But with every powerful bond in Port Charles comes the inevitable friction. As Cody and Molly grew closer, unresolved tensions began surfacing, old relationships, competing loyalties, and the ever-present ghosts of past decisions. What started as a surprising attraction had now become something worth fighting for, and neither of them seemed willing to let go. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between chaos, they were discovering not just each other but themselves. For Cody, it meant confronting years of emotional flight and learning to stand still. For Molly, it meant rewriting the narrative of who she thought she was supposed to love, and embracing the messy, beautiful truth of who she actually did. Together, they were rewriting more than their own story. They were changing the energy of the entire town. And that, more than anything, is what made their romance not just a moment, but a movement. A storm was coming, one built not on destruction, but on the wild, untamed force of unexpected love. And Tracy, against all odds, was smiling. Liesl sat across from Jason, her expression shifting between restrained grief and icy determination. The kind of emotional duality only she could wear so convincingly. The air between them was charged, not just with memory, but with the weight of secrets that had been buried too long. Jason, still grappling with his own re-entry into a world that had changed drastically in his absence, found himself unusually quiet as Liesl leaned forward, her voice low but cutting with precision. The conversation began with caution, veiled words and indirect glances. But it quickly turned into something else, something explosive, when Liesl finally uttered the name both of them had been avoiding for too long, Britt. The moment her name was spoken, the entire dynamic in the room shifted. Jason's jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in response to the storm of emotion that swirled behind his normally unreadable gaze. Liesl, never one to dance around pain, delivered the news like a blade, sharp, swift, and deliberate. Britt was alive. Or at least, someone very much like Britt had resurfaced. And the mystery surrounding her reappearance was unraveling into something dangerous. This wasn't a simple resurrection, and it wasn't a miracle. It was a calculated event, orchestrated by forces that had long operated in the shadows of Port Charles and beyond. Liesl revealed that Britt's return had not been voluntary. She was being manipulated, watched, perhaps even reprogrammed. And behind the curtain, someone, perhaps multiple someones, were pulling the strings, resurrecting the dead for purposes unknown. Jason didn't speak, not at first. His entire being tensed as he processed the ramifications. He had grieved Britt, accepted her death as one of the countless losses his life had demanded. But now, with even the possibility of her return tangled in dark experiments and twisted obsessions, a part of him, buried deep beneath the hardened exterior, began to burn. This wasn't just about Britt's survival. It was about who had done this, and why. Liesl, for all her cold logic, let a trace of maternal fear flicker across her face. She admitted that she had seen signs for months, whispers in WSB files, surveillance anomalies, intercepted transmissions that hinted someone had been collecting biological data from the remains of fallen operatives. At the center of it all, Britt. Jason asked the only question that mattered, where is she? Liesl didn't have an answer. All she had were pieces. A facility in Berlin that had been shut down days after an anonymous leak. A surgeon with connections to Cassadine Labs who disappeared without a trace. And a recent sighting of a woman matching Britt's description, seen boarding a freighter bound for South America. Nothing solid. Nothing actionable. But Jason knew what came next. He didn't need permission. He didn't need a plan. He needed to move. Because if Britt was alive, and in danger, then nothing else mattered. Liesl, sensing the gathering storm within him, warned him that whoever had Britt now wasn't just playing with science, they were playing with loyalty, memory, and control. The woman Jason might find may not remember him. She might not even remember herself. But Jason didn't flinch. His bond with Britt had never been about the surface. It was forged in fire, tested in loss, and strengthened by the unspoken understanding of two people who had lived too long in the gray space between good and evil. Their conversation ended not with a goodbye, but with an understanding. Jason would go after Britt. And Liesl, for all her caution, would help however she could, even if it meant betraying old allegiances or resurrecting contacts she had sworn to leave behind. Because this wasn't just about saving Britt. This was about stopping whatever new horror had been unleashed in Port Charles. Whatever mad science had dragged the dead back to life for reasons far beyond compassion. Jason stepped into the shadows, not with vengeance, but with purpose. And somewhere, out in the darkness, the echo of Britt's name began to stir a sleeping war. Martin had stumbled upon something he was never meant to find, a discovery that could change everything. Hidden in Drew's office behind a worn section of wallpaper, a faded envelope sealed with brittle wax bore no name, no date, only the strange symbol of a phoenix etched in dark ink. What was meant to be a moment of idle waiting became the beginning of a new obsession. He hadn't been snooping, it was a pure accident. Dropping his phone near the corner of the desk, he reached down and noticed a jagged edge in the wallpaper, barely visible unless someone was inches from the floor. Pulling it back with care, he found the envelope wedged between the drywall and old paneling, sealed tightly, as if time itself had forgotten it. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax. Inside was a handwritten letter, elegant, hurried, and unmistakably emotional. It spoke in cryptic phrases about the child who should not exist, a forged resurrection, and the consequences of loving the wrong person. But most disturbing of all was the name mentioned in the postscript, Britt. From that moment, Martin knew this wasn't just any old letter. It was a confession. A warning. Possibly both. And now he was holding a secret that tied Britt, Drew, and someone else, maybe Jason, maybe someone far worse, into a tangled knot of deceit. The more he read, the more obsessed he became. He had questions no one could answer, and every path led back to that same unsettling truth. Drew was hiding something that could destroy lives. The language in the letter hinted at falsified death records, genetic anomalies, and an orchestrated deception that seemed almost too large to be real. But Martin had been in Port Charles long enough to know that nothing was ever as it seemed. He began revisiting old case files, digital records, and legal archives. He tracked down mentions of Britt's supposed death and found discrepancies, tiny, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in the hospital logs, patient transfers, and autopsy reports. He reviewed Drew's financials and found a series of unaccounted transactions linked to a shell company dissolved right before Britt's death. He even uncovered a sealed WSB document signed by a handler who vanished shortly afterward. It became clear, someone powerful was pulling strings. And Martin had accidentally pulled on a thread that might unravel everything. But he wasn't just curious now. He was deeply invested. What had begun as an innocent mistake became a labyrinth he couldn't leave. He started acting strangely, more secretive, distracted, withdrawn. Tracy noticed first, then Lucy. Even Valentine asked if Martin was okay. He brushed it off, but the truth was, the letter haunted him. If Drew really knew what was written, if Britt wasn't just alive but being used, manipulated, or worse, then Martin had a moral obligation to act. Yet doing so would pit him against Drew, and possibly Jason. He'd be digging into the past of a man revered in Port Charles. A man the public still saw as a hero. What disturbed Martin most was the implication that someone else knew. The letter made veiled references to a second accomplice, someone buried in plain sight. Someone with the voice of family but the heart of vengeance. Martin wondered if this meant Nina, or Liesel, or maybe someone unexpected, perhaps even Willow. And as he followed breadcrumb after breadcrumb, his fears grew. Was he the only one who had stumbled into this storm, or was he now being watched? Martin began securing copies of the evidence he collected, locking them away in off-site storage and encrypted files. He knew that if something happened to him, someone needed to carry the torch. The weight of the secret was suffocating, but he couldn't unknow what he now knew. Drew's connection to Britt's mysterious fate, the manipulation of death and identity. And a possible conspiracy tied to WSB or beyond. It was no longer just a question of legality. It was a question of survival. As the days passed, Martin's obsession grew. And he knew he was on the verge of a breakthrough, or a breakdown. One wrong step, and he could end up just like Britt, erased, buried, forgotten. But one right move, and he might finally bring the truth to light. Either way, there was no turning back. The letter had opened a door that would never close again. Nina was shattered in a way she hadn't felt since her years in the coma, a silent collapse not of the body, but of the heart. Willow, the daughter she had fought so desperately to know, had looked her in the eye and refused to recognize any bond between them. No amount of begging, no torrent of maternal remorse, could undo the pain Willow carried or the choices she had made to sever the fragile thread still connecting them. It was a brutal rejection. One that stripped Nina of any illusion of reconciliation and sent her spiraling into a quiet storm of shame, fury, and hopelessness. It was in that moment of despair, in the shadowy quiet of a hospital corridor where Hope had just died, that Portia found her. Portia had seen this kind of devastation before, on faces in trauma bays, in mothers clutching lifeless children, in her own mirror when the world failed her. But Nina's collapse was different. It wasn't just grief, it was fury wrapped in guilt. And Portia recognized the dangerous edge of it. She sat beside her, offering comfort where she could. But something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition that pain this deep demanded more than tears. It demanded resolution. Revenge. Portia hadn't forgotten the chaos Drew had caused either. His manipulation of Willow, his collusion with Liesel, his reckless deceptions that endangered so many lives, including her own family's, had not been forgiven. And now that Willow was crumbling, now that Nina had lost everything she had tried to reclaim, the seed of something darker took root. Portia had tried reason, tried ethics, but Drew had crossed too many lines. And she was done playing fair. In Nina's despair, she saw clarity. In Nina's need for justice, she saw purpose. Together, they could reset the scales. The idea began quietly, almost hypothetical, but quickly spiraled into something more calculated. Portia had access to labs, to records, to information no one else could manipulate. Nina had connections, old favors she hadn't yet called in. And more importantly, she had nothing left to lose. The two women, broken in different ways by Drew's interference, began to piece together a blueprint for retribution. Not messy violence, but elegant exposure. Legal sabotage. Social ruin. They would dismantle Drew not with bullets or blades, but with truth and leverage. But even the best-laid plans needed a catalyst. That catalyst came in the form of an encrypted file Portia stumbled across, something flagged by a hospital algorithm she helped implement. A file linked to Drew's past records that had been quietly accessed and edited weeks prior. At first, Portia thought it was an error, but cross-referencing timestamps and personnel clearance, she realized the edits had been performed from an off-network device. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to hide something. And whatever it was tied to Britt. This discovery uncoiled a new layer to their plan. If Britt was alive, as some whispers in the shadows of Port Charles now implied, and if Drew had orchestrated her disappearance to protect secrets known only to him, then they weren't just dealing with betrayal. They were dealing with conspiracy. And if they could expose it, they wouldn't just ruin Drew, they'd control the story. Nina clung to the plan as if it were the last rope keeping her from drowning. Her pain needed an outlet, and revenge gave her purpose again. Portia, too, began to find focus in the plan. No longer a passive healer, she embraced her role as strategist, using every tool at her disposal: hospital systems, security access, medical knowledge, to pull at the threads of Drew's carefully spun narrative. They weren't merely reacting anymore. They were moving forward with intent. But with every move they made, they knew they were inviting danger. Drew was a man with layers, protected not just by reputation but by allies in high places: Jason, Carly, even Sunny, to an extent. One misstep and their entire operation could implode. Yet neither woman hesitated. For Nina, it was about reclaiming agency. For Portia, it was about restoring control. And for both, it was about watching Drew Kane fall. The days that followed were filled with secrets, with coded phone calls and sleepless nights spent mapping out legal vulnerabilities, medical discrepancies, and financial irregularities. They traced contacts Britt had once had, reviewed surveillance backups from the night of her death, and followed every lead with the precision of surgeons carving into a cancerous truth. The closer they got, the more volatile their mission became. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason began to sense that something was shifting. The balance of power was tipping. What he didn't know, yet, was that Nina and Portia were already too deep in the game to turn back. Their pain had crystallized into resolve, and Drew's downfall was no longer an idea. It was an inevitability. Port Charles would soon feel the shockwave. But for now, two women, once discarded, once dismissed, were holding the match. And the blaze would begin with a whisper.